that allowed me to go, well, why do I hate grits? And I started looking at what grits used to be historically, how corn turned into this disgusting, dead snake skin, slimy stuff on the plate. And that allowed me to do a real interesting historical arc.
This is Taste. I'm your host, Matt Rodbard. Over the last 9 years, journalist Shane Mitchell has braved snakes, fire ants, floods, rallies, marches, protests, pageants, and near heat stroke to write the essays contained in her new collection of work published in The Bitter Southerner. The Crop Cycle, Stories with Deep Roots, has Shane traveling throughout the South, uncovering history, both past and modern, and reporting on major topics such as farm labor, race, gender, and the history of the Georgia peach. Shane has incredible writing chops and has contributed memorable stories for Taste as well. We go over all of this in a terrific episode. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Shane Mitchell, welcome to This Is Taste. Great to see you in the studio.
Hi, Matt. Thank you for having me here.
Well, we've known each other for a very long time, and middle long time, I'll say. I wish I knew you longer because your career is so incredible. We could talk about your time at Saveur on this episode, but we're not, because that's another episode that we'll do in the future because I want you back, and I'd love to have you writing for Taste again.
Oh, yes, please.
We're here to talk about The Crop Cycle, Stories with Deep Roots, your new collection, which is a culmination of your work with The Bitter Southerner. And I am just blown away by the work, the detail, the reporting. But before we get into the book, I want to talk about something that really struck me from your bio. Quote, Shane challenges systematic Southern cultural bias without reservation, but also finds joy in the eccentric rituals of the region. Shane, what does that mean?
Matt, you had to grow up with my family to know what a big gravitational pull the South is on me. I was born up here in Manhattan, and maybe that gives me a certain perspective that other people might not have on the South. But I am still haunted by ghosts whenever I walk down King Street in Charleston and they're whispering in my ear about why I'm wearing blue jeans in public.
It's still those ghosts whisper, the etiquette, the draw of the South. Wow.
Yes. So that's part of what makes me want to write about the culture there in a way that other people don't.
Yeah, I think you write in the collection and throughout. I would say there's a lot of you in these essays, which I love because that could be self-indulgent, but it's absolutely not. It's essential in linking the North and the South. How do you think about switching between third person and first person in your writing?
It's to just give a platform to the people who are speaking. I'm being observational, and rather than critical. And so it also, to give more context, let's understand my family has been in that region since the 1600s. And so I have a history there that I need to share with people, the good, the bad, and the disgraceful.
Yeah, well said, because you cover such heavy topics. You cover labor, you cover big ag, you cover slavery. I mean, it's the big topics of America. And when you wrote your first essay about grits and you published it in June 2015, did you think that this would be a series or a cycle? I love the word cycle. It's a tremendous word, and we think of it a lot with like modern art, but I think you clearly have landed on a cycle. Were you planning on a larger work?
No, not at all. This evolved over time, and the stories evolved over time. There are a few leitmotifs throughout, and those seemed to make their way up to the surface as I started to write them. Each one of the stories, however, there's a clear linking with the narrative, I always start out each story with a personal anecdote about some member of my family and how each of those crops is related to something that we experience personally, and then draw back to telling a bigger narrative about, what the crop is about, why it's important, who made it important, who was ignored, who wasn't
Yeah.
acknowledged. So it gives you a deeper understanding of each crop. When we finally started talking about putting this all together in a collection, it was fairly recent. But in the back of everybody's mind, it was like, this could be going then in that direction.
Tell us a little bit about Bitter Southerner. I'd like to just zoom out a little bit and just get into the publication. And we've had Kyle, one of the founders, on the show, and I'll link to that episode in the show notes. It is an independent publication. It is done with so much heart, and I am the biggest fan of the work that is put into the publication.
I first started noticing Bitter Southerner very early on when they started publishing online, and someone mentioned one of their stories about mariachis in Atlanta, and I was like, "What? There's mariachis in Atlanta? I had no idea." And I read the story, and it was fabulous. It gave you a real sense of a craft and art that was experienced in Atlanta in a way I didn't know about. So I was very excited about that, and I just basically liked it. And
just on Twitter, you hit the heart.
Hit the heart.
Yeah,
which missed the heart.
Yeah, we do. We miss old Twitter.
Yeah. So, but that sort of started it. Kyle reached out to me and asked if I'd consider writing something, and we discussed different topics. But I had noticed they really didn't have any food writing early on, and I can write on many topics, obviously, but I said, if you're missing an opportunity if you're not writing about food in the South.
Yeah.
And the editor at the time was saying, well, what would you want to write about? And I said, well, let's write about grits. And the comeback was, well, grits, it's been written about. Everyone knows about grits. Why would you want to write about grits? And I said, you don't understand. I hate grits. And that was all that was needed. It was like, go.
Yeah. But man, and wow, you did more than just noodle on your hatred of grits. It could have been a first person humorous essay. But in your writing about grits, you do a beautiful weave. You bring in deep family history, touching on food industrialization, and tap into the deep history of the Southern foodways. These are really tricky needles to thread, and Shane, you do it so well. So about the grits, many of us listening may have only experienced grits through like Bob Evans and Waffle House. Was that why you hated it? Was it? I mean, I know you had a family history with it, but there's a lot of bad versions of grits. So what did you take away from this remit from Bitter Southerner to write about grits, and what did you end up finding out?
Okay, so let me just say, if your listeners' only experience is diner chain grits, they haven't lived yet.
Yeah, absolutely true.
For me, growing up, it was a touchstone from my parents living up north to the food that they grew up with, and specifically my mom. Who was the one who was making the grits. But because she had 5 kids, she was in a rush a lot. So we had a lot of instant grits. And instant grits is probably the most disgusting food you can ever put in your mouth. And if you're like a stubborn child, like I was, and you sat at the table too long and they got cold, it could get so slimy and nasty on the bottom. I had epic battles with my mother. And I would wind up sitting at the breakfast table until noon.
She was one of those parents.
Yes.
Okay.
You will finish your plate. But that allowed me to go, well, why do I hate grits? And I started looking at what grits used to be historically, how corn, which is a new world product,
Yeah.
a crop, um, turned into this disgusting, dead snake skin, slimy stuff on the plate. And that allowed me to do a real interesting historical arc.
Yeah, I mean, the arc talks about, I would say it goes back 200 years, right? You're going into deep history. And in general, with grits, as a home cook, how do we stay away from those slimy? I love snakeskin. That's I mean, like, wow, talk about a buzzkill for a food podcast to hear that word snakeskin. But how do you avoid that?
Well, it's all about buying grits from the right people. And especially now, what part of the story addressed was the new grits revolution that's happened.
Yeah.
And actually, I should technically say the new corn
Mm-hmm.
revolution, the revival of heirloom varieties, the recovery of corn varieties that had been dormant for decades, if not more than a century, and that were stored in vaults and stored in jars in people's refrigerators on porches. And, it was all about looking at how seed keepers and seed savers have been able to bring these delicious corn
Mm.
varieties back into our pantry. So there's that aspect. And then there's this revival of small batch milling that's gone on. And that has really taken off. So there's so many millers. The one I featured in the corn story is Greg Johnsman of Marsh Hen Mill.
Mm-hmm.
So Greg was very involved with reviving Jimmy Red,
Mm-hmm.
which is such an amazing corn. And it's the one grits I ate that I didn't want to throw up
Yeah.
after eating it.
Is that a brand we can seek out
Yes.
in stores? How do we buy it?
Yes, you can. So it depends. In the South, you could go to a lot of stores, a lot of grocery stores and find it. Or you can buy it online.
Yeah.
They do mail order.
Jimmy Red.
Jimmy
looking for.
Red.
Okay. So on to rice. You dig into the iconic Uncle Ben, and listeners may be familiar with the popular Mars own brand of rice. How did Uncle Ben allow you to dig into the history and resurrection of Carolina Gold rice?
Well, that story, sort of the underlying theme of that story is about marketing.
Yes.
So, for context, at one time, Carolina Gold was a commercial variety. It's not the precious heirloom, $10 a bag rice that it is now.
Absolutely delicious too.
Oh, yes.
Incredible
yes.
rice.
Yes.
Yeah, and J.J. Johnson has been on the show talking about Carolina Gold in
Right.
detail.
Right. But it's a short grain rice. It's more like a risotto.
Yeah.
You would not put chicken gravy on it. But the issue with Ben's, which is now called Ben's Original,
Yep.
let's be clear that the Mars company has evolved since I think it was 2020 that they changed the name finally, and took the gentleman who was a waiter, who was their mascot.
Yeah, you had written about the iconic Uncle Ben character that is seen on the rice, or was a real person in Chicago.
Yes.
And was paid $500 to sit for a portrait. Very
Yes.
interesting.
Yes. So that image, similarly to, say, Aunt Jemima, or the chef from Cream of Wheat, those were all very sort of racially charged images of people who you would think might be cooking your food. And so that led to sort of my ability to tie the two together, because let's remember who grew the Carolina Gold originally in specifically South Carolina, and who was actually in the field planting it versus who was profiting from it. So that allowed me to write a very big narrative.
Yeah.
But also I wanted to be very specific as far as acknowledging my family's aspect in that narrative because my family grew rice.
Oh wow, really? And
Yeah.
you write about that, of course. And what personal history did you place into this work?
The context that I wanted to create was who's growing it now.
Got it.
And at the time, it was one of my younger cousins who was in her 20s. She had studied with people like Joel Salatin, and she had worked on a number of different sort of organic projects and farming projects. This was a way to recover and restore old rice fields on the Combahee River and bring them back into use because they were just sitting there with a bunch of alligators floating around
Yeah.
in the canals. So this was a project that the family wanted to try, and she grew out the first crops, and it was an amazing. The flavor profile of the rice was extraordinary. And rice is a tricky one because rice evolves in flavor. You can lose the flavor of the rice over the genetic time.
Yeah.
So tasting that particular rice again was so amazing for everyone in my family to
Yeah.
see it back.
Your book is The Crop Cycle: Stories with Deep Roots, and please, listener, you should pick this up and have it by your bedside, and you can just dip into these stories that tackle Southern foodways. And I want to talk about the story from Immokalee, Florida. You write about tomato farm workers, and you really you focus in on labor organization down there. And I just want to broadly get a sense about what did you learn about the tomatoes that we eat in our country 12 months a year, and the folks who are harvesting them.
Okay, so this was my come to Jesus moment, really,
Yeah.
is going to Immokalee and connecting with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is a nonprofit advocacy group that works towards fair labor, not just in the tomato harvesting sector, but all sectors that require seasonal labor. Immokalee is where tomatoes start growing. Our first tomatoes of the year come from Immokalee, Florida. But tomato harvest moves north through the season, and these are workers who migrate with the harvest. So I met harvesters in Immokalee who were picking tomatoes there, and then traveled as the season progressed all the way up to South Carolina with them, met them again up there to see how they were harvesting in the fields. And what's important to know is most off-season tomatoes that we buy in the supermarket are grown by big corporations that are agriculturally, industrially, that's the ag industrial complex. So these tomatoes have the flavor of cardboard for the most part. You know, they're as hard as a snow globe. These are not what you imagine when you listen to the song Homegrown Tomatoes.
Right.
But I had a worker who was one of the coalition's hunger strikers
Mm.
talk to me about what it was like to pick those little grape tomatoes
Yeah.
in the field and how grueling it is and how difficult it is to gather enough of those grape tomatoes to make enough money per day for harvest. And so that made me realize that I really didn't know where tomatoes were coming from. I didn't understand anything at the time about what those school buses that are painted white do when they get to these fields. I didn't know that there were small indications of "you're welcome here," little signs that would be put out in labor camps to welcome workers. It was a whole culture that is completely invisible to most people.
Shane, what were the conditions like for these workers? What types of housing did they have, and what was the food like that the workers were eating? Because I know you dug into this in this essay a little bit.
Yes. So a lot of them live in camps. A lot of them also live in houses that are rented by the producers.
Yeah.
And some of them are squalid. It's just disgraceful what some of the workers have to deal with. This wasn't just with tomatoes either. This I saw labor camps when I started investigating Vidalia onions as well, and so the conditions are pretty rough. 5 to 10 to 12 people to a mobile home, plus their children. The food is what they can afford. It depends. A lot of people have to buy food wherever they can go, because if they show up in a bigger public market, they might find themselves in jeopardy. So there's lots of little bodegas right off the fields where they can buy food. But I have to say, one of the women who I met, she taught me how to make the most amazing mole. And it was so heartwarming, and it's a mole that she knows specifically because she's from Guanajuato,
Mhm.
and it's a mole from Guanajuato, and she gifted me this
Wow.
recipe, and I still make it. I still make it just the way she taught me.
So tell me a little bit about the where these folks are coming from, and their kind of their status. And you hint at this when you just said when you couldn't go to a grocery store because they're maybe in jeopardy. Where are they coming from?
Well, okay. So there's a bigger conversation to have around two words. One is illegal, and the other is undocumented. These are workers who are either seasonal H-2A workers with a visa, or they are undocumented. And they came here specifically to be able to have a better life. They send money home. They buy families houses and clothes and food. I had one worker tell me that he was making $8 a day at home. So the $11 an hour here changed his whole family's life.
Yeah.
And for me, that's the most important aspect of that. But you have to remember that the guest worker program is very problematic and headed into what we're looking at in the next couple of years. It's going to be even a bigger issue to discuss.
Yeah, and Shane, I want to move on to talk about more of the essays, but I think you nailed it with the next 4 years being a pivotal time for these workers that you visited with, and the rhetoric versus the real talk, because I mean we can't as a culture survive without these types of workers.
No, who's going to pick your tomatoes?
Who's going to pick your tomatoes? This is a question we should always ask ourselves when reading the news each day. I want to take a break from the crop cycle and ask you about your 2016 book, Far Afield: Rare Food Encounters Around the World. And we published it here at Crown. And really, Shane, what a terrific book. And I just could not have you on the mic without asking you about this deeply reported work that I just love. Tell us a bit about it.
Okay, so Far Afield, really what that is that book emerged from years of field work and reporting narratives from people who are keeping some of our oldest food traditions going. Icelandic sheep herders, Hawaiian taro farmers, Peruvian potato farmers, Uruguayan gauchos. These are all people who are way out in the world, and keeping these stories alive and sharing that kind of food that they've always had. I found through assignments being able to sort of go off off the grid
Yeah.
to get to spend time with a lot of people who are doing that. So it took a lot of convincing, and I'm so grateful to Aaron.
Aaron Winter, yep.
Yes, who finally got it. I showed some images around, and I must credit James Fisher, the photographer at the time, who shot the whole book. I knew I had to I had to show the hardest story to get them to accept everything else. Because if somebody in publishing flinched at the hardest story, I wasn't going to give it to them. And that was about young Maasai warriors slaughtering a sheep. And it's pretty graphic. But it's also really beautiful.
Yeah. And did you and James travel together for this
Yes.
work? So, I mean, it's really, just in brief, it's a book that is the book that a lot of journalists want to write but can never write because it takes so much effort in traveling the world with a documentary style photographer and really just getting in really close to culture. And how long did it take to write the book?
It took about 9 years.
Yeah.
On and off. The last chapter that was reported, I think almost the last chapter, was actually in the jungle in Calais. So I was actually looking at someone else who was far from home. He was a refugee from Sudan.
Wow.
And he had wound up in this camp and was trying to get to claim asylum in England. And he was stuck there and in some of the most horrific conditions I've ever experienced. I had PTSD for a long time after I reported that story. Just watching, there was a 12-year-old boy from Kabul who had walked from Afghanistan and made it to France. And I just was like, how does that happen? How does a kid like that walk all the way across continents to get to this place? And I was basically told by people who translated for me, his parents knew he would die if he didn't go.
Wow.
So for me, that was sort of, and that actually was the story that won my first James Beard.
The piece that was later in the book. I
Yes.
see. I mean, this is like core Savor. I mean, this type of ethic, and you were on staff there and worked there and continue to work at Savor.
That wasn't for Savor, though.
Oh, okay. What was that for?
It was actually for Roads and Kingdoms.
Oh, Roads and Kingdoms. All right. Well, we're talking about some really great media here, and what's up with Savor right now? I can't let that pass. You're working with this great team.
Still there after all these years, and I'm so excited because Kat Craddock has just brought Savor roaring back.
I know.
It's and in all its beauty, the fall issue is stunning.
It really is.
Yes.
Pick it up. Support independent media. Pick up Bitter Southerner and, of course, The Crop Cycle. Okay, Shane, we ask this question often at the end of the show, and regular listeners will know that okra comes up about 30% of the time. We'll get to that question for you, by the way. But let me ask you, in your reporting on okra, what should we know about okra and its multiple personalities?
Okay. Well, let's understand where okra comes from, first of all. Some of the crops in this story were New World crops: corn, tomatoes, peanuts. But okra comes from away. And you have to understand how okra got here to know why it's so important. Okra is a seed that was carried here because of the Middle Passage. It was brought by people who were kidnapped from the west coast of Africa and sold into slavery. There's an oral history of how these seeds were transported, and not just okra, but like Benny, sesame, appears in the same way, carried by someone who's torn from their homeland and with only a few grains or a handful of seeds gathered and hidden during the journey. And honestly, this is one of the most powerful and compelling stories in food history in America is what those seeds represented to the people who brought them, and what a way of resisting such a terrible fate. That's the relevance of okra. Remember, though, that okra is mucilaginous.
Yeah.
It's gilly, so it binds things. So because of okra, we have gumbo. And gumbo, of course, is one of the most important dishes. It's so relevant to
In
so much
American
of, yeah,
foodways.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's what okra means.
I love that you talk about cooking with okra because I think, some folks are only roasting it and or eating it, on its own. But, I was watching the recent Chef's Table with Kwame Nwache and watching him cook with okra and using it as a binder and seeing him use it in a fully composed dish. And it really changes your perspective about how this crop is versatile. Just when you think about okra and eating it, how do you eat it yourself?
Dunked in cornmeal and fried.
I mean, definitely fry that thing.
It's good.
It's good. It's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I will say, we should remember that the South is not a dichotomy anymore. There are so many cultures in the South that have introduced their own ways of cooking okra. There's everyone from the subcontinent who has introduced, like bindi masala.
Yeah.
There's the Chinese way of cooking okra. There's the Hmong version of cooking okra. So it is important to know that there are so many tasty ways.
Absolutely well said. Duane Allman famously said, "Every time I'm in Georgia, I eat a peach for peace." So what does that mean? And how did this quote kind of get you into this beautiful essay about Georgia peaches?
Okay, so first of all, my husband is a major fan of the Allman Brothers. And I've been to so many residencies at the Beacon Theater. I got to see Warren Haynes walk onto the stage for the first time to play with Dickie Betts and
Oh
Greg
my.
Allman. And little did I know, I mean, I was just buying a ticket to go see a band. But it's important to know what Duane was actually saying when he said, "I eat a peach for peace," because that was in an interview. And he was asked what he was doing for the revolution. And he was referring to the Vietnam War protests. And it was an incredibly turbulent time. It was the early 1970s, and it was coinciding with the civil rights movement. And that "eat a peach" remark would become a tribute to Duane because he died in a motorcycle accident before their third album came out, which is, quite frankly, their biggest hit album. And it's called "Eat a Peach" because they wanted to memorialize Duane. So that's where it came from.
In the essay, you write about the many varieties of peaches in Georgia, and I just think, it's like pure peach porn. If you enjoy a peach, and many of us do, you should read this essay and talk about peaches as a product with great diversity. I think in the North, we have a very limited season. This season was fantastic in New York State.
This was a good year.
This was a great year. Last year was the opposite. It was a terrible year. I don't know why, but we only have a limited amount at our farmers markets. But what is it like down in Georgia eating peaches from your point of view?
I'll tell you, I had this experience at the University of Georgia Peach Lab, where I was with the horticulturalist who is in charge of the peach farm that UGA owns. And I'm standing there at the height of peach season under a tree, and peach juice is dripping on my head. The peaches were that ripe. And I had never had any experience with fruit like that ever, where I could actually reach up into the tree, grab a peach that was perfect. And you know how much of a roulette game getting a ripe peach
Yeah.
is.
And then all over the country, even in Georgia, you can
Yeah.
get some pretty crummy peaches.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
You can. There's so many variables.
Yeah.
But to be able to stand there and literally like have it dripping on my
Ugh,
face, it was just wonderful.
incredible. I mean, Shane, how do you like to cook with peaches? Do you have any methods?
Well, there is a recipe by a wonderful woman named Dory Sanders who had an incredible cookbook. And Dory was a peach farmer, is a peach farmer. And she had a recipe in her book called Miracle Pie. And it's not a cake, it's not a cobbler. It's just this magical way of baking peaches in a batter that puffs up and over the peaches. And Bitter Southerner has a link to the Miracle Pie recipe on its website.
I will link to that absolutely in the show notes. It's like it's a peach cake in some ways,
Yes,
is what
it
you're
is.
describing.
Yeah, it's a batter cake.
Batter
basically.
cake, but it
Yeah.
has, what's the knife cut on the peaches? Are they pretty loose? I mean, are you getting bursts of peach?
Oh yes, all over. I mean, it's basically like mostly peach held together with just think of it as like a big fluffy pancake filled with peaches.
Oh my gosh. And I feel like you could probably use some off-season peaches for this too.
You can.
Oh, you're like,
You can even use canned peaches if you're desperate. You know, there's nothing wrong with canned peaches.
we have recipe in Korea World for canned peaches, which I mean, love canned peaches, like incredible, especially from Korea. They're amazing.
Oh, sure.
Well, Shane, I just really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and as a fellow writer, that your work is filled with color and precision and voice, but really what it's built around is your determination to report, and that is something that I think many can learn from. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Matt. That's so very kind of you to say.
I really mean
means
it.
a lot.
I really mean it. You've written for Taste, and I cannot let this pass. You wrote this incredible story. You pitched me, and I was like right away, like, let's get on the phone and talk about it. And you were able to visit with Diana Kennedy, the great Mexican cuisine expert and cookbook author. And you were able to capture this moment in San Antonio where you sat down with her and a library who were acquiring her cookbook collection. I'm going to link to this story in the show notes, and tell me, what did you learn, and what was that like, just sitting down with somebody, at the end of her life, and she did go on to pass away a few years later. What was that like?
Diana was fierce. I mean, she was, and also fiercely protective of her work. And that's something that I also have come to understand. It's really important to champion yourself when you're doing difficult work. And she sold her collection of rare 19th century cookbooks to the University of Texas. And after she died, the rest of her papers were added. But what was great about that experience of meeting her was understanding what she wanted to leave behind, she wanted her legacy to be, and sharing those books rather than allowing them to be sold to another collector was eye-opening. And now everyone can access the earliest books that exist that relate to the Mexican culinary world. I think the earliest one is from 1828.
Yeah.
And it's the first one that references actual Mexican cooking, not Spanish influenced or European influenced cooking, but Mexican cooking. So from a scholarly aspect, what she did was just mind blowing.
And this leads to my next question. This was a story where you're just like, man, I'm getting on a plane, I'm going to San Antonio to report on this. And this is a common refrain in your work, Shane. You have this desire to tell these stories. And I just want to close and just ask you, what drives you to a subject to really go out there and travel and really dig in a way that I think is rare in food writing. I think we are under budgeted, of course, in this world. You make it work financially. You also are able to spend the amount of time required, which again is not as common as it used to be. What drives you to get on a plane and go report?
Wow. It's a framework for tackling big issues in a way that people can digest. And that's not intended as a pun. It's some of these issues are so hard to look at, so hard to talk about. But if you do it as through a framework of food, it can be an easier way to access these narratives. One of the two reporting tools that I have is I always ask who their favorite sports team is.
Mm-hmm.
Most specifically, anywhere outside of the U.S., it's what's your soccer team? What's your soccer team? And secondly, I say, what are you having for dinner? And that leads into a whole conversation. And I can be invited in. It's like, come on in, see what mom's cooking. Let's talk about, how ICE raided my neighbors the other day.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what's going on down the road in that factory with all the chickens. It leads to a greater conversation. And I think those are conversations that are hard, but you need to keep talking about them.
Yeah. You have a real gift in conversation. Obviously, just reading your work, you can really connect with your interview subjects in a way that yields these terrific stories.
It's all that Southern charm my mom jammed down my throat with the grits.
Tell me, what's the future for you right now? Are you working on anything, project wise that you can talk about? Any book projects? Well, what's on the horizon?
There's something brewing, yes, but I can't really talk about it yet. But yeah, there's a further journey.
Can you just say where you're traveling? Do you have any plans in the next 6 months to go out?
Yeah, so I'm going back, I think, to the South.
Okay.
I see the South as a crucible for a lot of things that are happening now, especially for younger people. And it's a way for me to understand what they think about what's going on. So yeah, that's where I'm going.
Shane, I look forward to reading your next works, and please pick up the book. It is terrific. On This Is Taste, we ask guests about the discerning taste. So to close this interview, here's a little rapid fire, fast and furious taste check. Are you ready?
Yes.
The best fruit.
Ripe.
Great answer. Great dodge. You're ready for it. Give me one non-peach ripe fruit that you just love.
Blackberries.
They're usually pretty sour.
Not if you find them on the vine at the right time of year.
I love that. Okay, the worst vegetable, there's got to be one.
Overcooked. Anything overcooked.
Yeah.
Green beans overcooked with a pound of butter, the way my cousins used to do it.
Yeah. You just need to have the snap.
Yes.
Respect the snap. The best dessert.
Pie a la mode.
Always vanilla?
No, not always. Sometimes I like butter pecan.
I love that. My grandmother was raised in northern Minnesota, and that was her favorite flavor.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And she was the only person who was not from the South who liked butter pecan that I met.
Oh, gosh.
It's underrated.
I gravitated to butter pecan when Breyer stopped doing their almond. Butter almond.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You can get butter almond. That's
butter almond was the best.
That's amazing. Your favorite city outside America to visit for food?
Tokyo.
Yeah. Have you written about Tokyo?
Yes, a lot.
Yeah.
A lot. One of my aunts is Japanese.
Oh, wonderful. And what was that story that comes to mind when you talk about writing about Tokyo?
Well, just for some context, my uncle was in Vietnam and he met my aunt when he was in Okinawa, based in Okinawa. And my aunt Yoshi was a flight attendant for Japan Airlines. So when they got married, her family, who is from Kyushu,
Hmm.
was not happy and cut her off.
Wow.
And he brought her back to the US and she brought us omiyagi gifts. So as a child, I had a kimono and a little, girls got dolls, boys got dolls as children. And so from childhood, I had this fascination with Japan. I learned how to speak the language. I speak terrible Japanese, but enough to get around. And I just fell in love with the food. And for me, Tokyo is like the equivalent of New York. You can get an incredibly good sandwich on the street. You can get a slice of pizza on the street in Tokyo, but you can have one of the world's most extraordinary meals there.
It's
So,
so true.
um,
Give me one New York City restaurant that you wish could come back from the dead.
we were talking about this yesterday. It's so bizarre. We were talking about Maxwell's Plum.
Oh my gosh. New York Mag just did a great piece about it in their
Did
throwback
they?
issue.
Oh,
Yes.
whoa.
Check it out online. It's
Okay.
there.
Because I lived on First Avenue when I first got out of college, and Maxwell's Plum was down the block.
Wow.
And my parents took me there for my birthday once. And it was a scene.
Yeah. Yeah. The New York Mag article is really it paints a picture of a scene.
Oh my God. Or sadly, R.I.P. La Guanhui.
Yeah.
I'm sad about that one
Yeah.
too.
Your favorite cookbook of all time?
Wow, that's difficult. That's actually difficult. I have a huge collection of cookbooks. I would have to say maybe not favorite, but the one that's most splattered with grease and stuff
Yeah.
is the Junior League of Charleston's cookbook,
Oh,
the
wow.
spiral bound one.
Of course.
Yeah.
The only way.
Well, it has a
Right.
difficult legacy, so I had to mention that too,
Yeah.
because a lot of those recipes were not by those ladies.
Yeah.
They were by the people who cooked in their houses.
But the recipes are ones you go back to.
The recipes really sort of it's a history book of Southern food. It's fascinating.
A favorite recent cookbook discovery?
Yours.
Oh man.
It's on. No, seriously. I'm not.
Oh.
I'm not kidding. It's sitting on my table in the kitchen. I have a stack of books that I plan to cook through the whole winter
Oh.
because where I live, it's so isolated.
Yeah.
There's no restaurants. And just thumbing through it, I was like, "Ooh, I want to cook that. Ooh, I want to cook that. How do you cook that?" I was so fascinated. It's such a beautiful book.
Well, that's really nice of you. You did not have to say that.
No, I know.
You said that before, though. You did tell me, you wrote me that, and that's really kind.
Yes.
Yeah, it's called Korea World. I'm just going to have to plug
Right.
it. For those who
Please.
don't know, you say my book. Thank you for that. Last one, your favorite sandwich.
I hate sandwiches.
Why? Oh my gosh, Shane.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I know.
I'm
I mean,
just taken a little bit aback by this.
Okay, you have to understand that when I first started working here in New York, I was at Hearst magazines. It was my first job as an editor, and I couldn't afford to eat anything but sandwiches. It was sandwiches for lunch, sandwiches for dinner.
Yeah, it's a beautiful song, by the way.
which is a good thing. But if I had to dig deep and I had to order a sandwich, it's actually a childhood favorite, and it's kind of everyone up north would go ew, but it's cream cheese and olive on squishy white bread.
Yo, that is an amazing sandwich.
I took it to school as a kid. My mom would send me to school with that sandwich. I got teased so badly for that sandwich. So I'm here to represent it, I have to say.
Well, that sandwich is available at S&P downtown.
Is it?
Yes, it is.
Oh,
and I've ordered
wow.
it many times because
I
I
have to
love that
go.
sandwich.
Yeah. Okay, I'm glad to know S&P is
S&P is representing,
good.
and it's green olives, of course.
Yes, of course, with the little pimento-y things in the middle.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And that feels very Southern.
It is. Well, there's the one that I usually order is from a pharmacy soda fountain in Charlottesville.
Yeah.
It's a very old-fashioned soda fountain in the back of the drugstore. And you go in the back, and all the UVA grad lawyers are back in there having their lunch. And there's a fireplace, working fireplaces, and the ladies bake all the pies and cakes. And that cream cheese and olive sandwich is on the menu, toasted or not.
I think you might like that sandwich.
Yeah,
I think there's one sandwich you like.
that transcends sandwich, though, for me.
Shane Mitchell, thank you so much for joining This Is Taste.
Matt, thank you for having me come talk to you today.
This Is Taste is hosted by Eliza Abarbanel and me, Matt Rodbard. The show is produced by Shalia Harris and Pat Stango and edited by Clayton Gumbert. Theme music by Steve Rydell. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for updates on all cool things that are happening.